Our meeting is back in order. Executive Vice Chancellor Skinner, please start. And I am very excited about your report. Item 4.4, 2010-11 system budget.
Good afternoon, President Malumed, Chancellor Scott, members of the Board of Governors. The issue that is before you is an update on the state budget, and with a focus on the 2010-11 state budget that's being negotiated at this time in the state capitol. And I'll keep the conversation brief. That was a very interesting conversation around revenue generation and capacity building in the system, and realize that probably took more of the afternoon than you thought. In terms of where we're at right now with the state budget, from a technical perspective, from a process perspective, we're in the process they call conference committee, which is when the Senate and the Assembly come together to try to reconcile their two different versions of the budget and come up with one unified plan that then can either kick off Big Five conversations or potentially go to the governor. The legislature commenced their conference committee work in early June, on June 3rd, and they met fairly regularly through the month of June, although the last 2 weeks or so they seem to have stalled out. The reason for the stalling out appears to have been that the Democrats in the Assembly and the Senate had fundamentally different structures of their budget plan, the big pieces of it, the level of funding, the sources of those funding, the source of those resources, where the cuts were focused were different in the two plans, and it took a while for the Democrats to get together. Apparently, at this point, there is a unified plan that's in place. We haven't seen all the details of it, and they have not. The legislature has not acted on that unified plan in the conference committee setting. That's where we're likely to get more detail on what's included. But our understanding is that that compromise plan that the Democrats seem to have arrived at would provide Prop 98 funding that's a little bit less than the Senate's initial plan. It would provide Prop 98 funding of $54 billion, and those resources would, that represents about $1.8 billion more than the governor's proposal for Prop 98. And again, we haven't seen all the details of that plan. It's, I think, probably a safe bet that $1.8 billion probably largely goes to K-12 education. They did have some additional cuts above and beyond the cuts that were proposed for us, including a $1.5 billion cut in their base general purpose funds. That's largely probably where these funds would go in the compromise plan, is to undo that proposed reduction. So at this point, we're there's a lot of waiting and seeing. I think that it's likely that within the next week or so, we'll see the conference committee acting again, and perhaps starting to follow up on implementing this unified plan that's been shared mostly in press releases so far. That doesn't mean that we are going to see a budget deal by any means, but it just, we're stuck at this point where even the Democrats haven't been able to come together. And honestly, until they do, until the Democrats in the two houses can come together and come up with a unified position, it's really difficult for negotiations to proceed. The Republicans don't have somebody to negotiate with. The governor again is kind of left on the outside. So we're moving through a process. I think that it's worth noting that there appears to be little urgency at this point in the Capitol. Oftentimes this time of year when these budget delays kick in, we reach this kind of a stalemate. It takes some type of a pressure point in terms of moving things forward, and we just don't have that kind of pressure point in play right now. There are a couple of potential pressure points that may come to bear. There's the issue of state workers being paid the minimum wage that Chancellor Scott discussed earlier. There's maybe perhaps more likely to be a pressure point would be the state would no longer have the authority to make payments to colleges, to really most sectors of government are not do not have the ability to receive payment. The state doesn't have the authority to give money to those entities in the absence of a state budget. And K-12 schools are probably the largest exception. The majority of their funding flows regardless of state budget being in place. But what we'll see beginning at the end of July, that's when the budget authority really runs out, and you'll see that the colleges will no longer receive their apportionment payments, and so they'll have to start living off their own reserves or local reserves in order to weather the budget impasse. Local governments will be going through a very similar process. You'll also see vendors who operate under state contracts, they won't be paid. And so the pressure will slowly start building as all these both public and private entities face delays in their payments. That creates some pressure, but it honestly takes a while for that to build. And then the next pressure point, probably the most significant pressure point that's coming up is not until September, when by most forecasts the state's going to start running out of cash, which is a different problem than not having the budget authority. At the end of July, the states will still have cash, but they won't have the authority to hand the money out. But it's when you get further into the process into September, when, for instance, K-12 schools legally should continue receiving their payments. Well, the state doesn't have any money to give them. They're out of luck, and so that's you'll see more pressure build into September. But at this point, there's quite a bit of pessimism about the process, and a lot of you hear some pretty kind of dire predictions about how long this could drag out this year. Not a lot of enthusiasm right now. So in this process, we're continuing to focus on our advocacy, and that's what we all should be doing during these times. The legislature has sent their members back to their local districts. They're working out of their local offices, and it's a great opportunity to connect with legislators in the local districts. We're encouraging districts to do that. We're encouraging you to do that. And the simple message that has been working for us and that we need to stay on is talking about the overwhelming demand that the colleges are facing right now. There's just a tremendous demand for community college education and training. It's being driven by those factors we've been talking about all year of high unemployment, students being shut out of UC and CSU, record numbers of high school graduates, and returning veterans. And these students need a place to again, receive their education and training. And that's the message that seems to be driving and resonating. We're staying focused on that $126 million that would fund 2.2% enrollment growth for our system and keep the doors open to about 60,000 students that otherwise are not going to be able to be served by the colleges. So that's the message we're staying on, and again, just from a high-level perspective, I think it's safe to say that the state budget process is stalling out. It's searching for a path, and it's probably going to take a little while for it, enough pressure to build to see some real clear forward progress. With that, I'm open to any questions.
What you didn't mention is August 31st is the end of the two-year session, and all the assembly members and half the senators go home to run for re-election in November. So has there ever been a time where the session ended and the budget still had not passed, which is one of those rumors that you hear now?
I'm not aware of that circumstance occurring before.
That would be very odd, I think, if that really happened.
But you're right. I mean, there's some very, very odd kind of forecasts that are out. I mean, a fair number of people will talk about that. We may see this budget process stall out until the next governor comes. You know, that there'll be this, you know, the wait till the election and maybe deal with the next governor. And that, I've heard that from both sides of the aisle, potentially seeing some benefit from that. I think if you really think that through, California will be in a very, very bad place if that comes to pass. But those are, it's I guess reflective of this kind of overall sense of pessimism and a lack of confidence in the ability for the state budget process to work effectively.
On the bright side, I know the Senate Democrats are having a caucus on Wednesday. So maybe. Are there any other caucuses that are going to happen this week?
I'm not aware of any others.
Okay. Any questions or comments? Member Zumi?
First of all, again, congratulations on your promotion, Eric, to Executive Vice Chancellor. Just curious, I mean, from what you said, if things did get pushed to the next governor, what would the situation be for most of the colleges, let's say in December, January, you know, if the things went out that far?
It would be dire. You would, you know, by and large, I think our colleges, our community college districts, along with a lot of other folks who are dependent on the state budget, have grown used to delays, and so they build in some type of an ability to either have some reserves or to borrow or something to carry them over. But no, I can't think of anybody who's got a plan in place that would take them through December, January. That's typically you start getting into August, and some districts are very start having to watch their balance sheets on a daily basis. September, it's very widespread that most districts are starting to sweat some bullets. So you get beyond that, and I think it's going to be a very desperate situation. It's going to be a real issue about being able to meet payroll. And I guess if there's any consolation, it'll be that the colleges won't be alone in that. It'll be widespread. Schools and other, again, all other agencies and level of government in California would be in a desperate situation. So hopefully it doesn't come to that. And I don't mean to sound too dark in all this. I mean, it's, you know, the reality is that oftentimes you get, you know, it's a situation gets the, you know, is the most frustrating and the most, you know, there's the clouds are darkest before, you know, before the storm occurs and the storm moves on. So hopefully we have a much better report to provide for you at your next meeting.
Member McDougall and Member Lockyer.
I hesitate to ask this question to show my ignorance, but I'll ask it anyway. But the question I have is whether there is a capability of the state legislature to pass in a piecemeal fashion annual allocations. For example, could the state legislature pass and the governor approve an annual budget for K-12, an annual budget for the community colleges, without dealing with the budget as a whole?
I don't know. Do you know?
There are limitations around such legislation, and really the issue is more that until the budget's passed, there are restrictions on what kind of bills can carry appropriations. It can be enacted that include appropriations, and so it's. I think the relevant language has to do with the appropriation needs to be for the ordinary and usual expenses of government. I think, and I could try to research that. It's been a little while since I've looked at it, but so it would be, I think, in a legally disputable realm about whether such piecemeal sections of the budget, or I mean, another approach would be if state leaders were going to pass an appropriation that would cover all of government, but just for another 60 days or 90 days in order to buy some time. But so those kind of stopgap measures may end up coming into play if this keeps dragging out.
I think we should explore at least the legalities and options that we have, because the way it's shaping up, it just sounds like it could be a rather terrible situation. It's not in the best interest of almost anyone. And if there are options that are possible, we should understand that they exist and perhaps considering encouraging their action on them.
Well, maybe you could explore that and see if that's
I'd be
even
happy to
an
research that.
option? Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Good thought. Member Lockyer, were you raising your hand?
No, I just was going to say, well, in that case, we might as well research the confines of declaring a state emergency. I think we need to be prepared as an entity to join together again to insist that a budget be passed before our community colleges are forced to shut down. So the earlier the notice that we get would be great.
Any other comments or thoughts? Member Reed?
One of the concerns that I've heard expressed from my district is that the reserves in some of the schools are sufficient to get through this calendar year and perhaps next. But then after that, it's turn out the lights type of situation. I just like to kind of have a general assessment as to the colleges in the system. How many are in dire straits at this point in time in terms of as we heard earlier today about one district through the accreditation process. Are there others?
I think it's safe to say that most districts are operating closer to the line than they have for some time. There were 2 districts that we had to accommodate by adjusting some payment schedules at the end of the end of the 2009-10 fiscal year. That was a signal to me that, I mean, cash flow in those districts, they were at risk of not making payroll. And we made some adjustments in order to ensure that they could close the year out. That's something I haven't had to do before in my tenure as vice chancellor. I think, again, I think it's a sign of where the districts are. I continue to think that most districts are probably going to be okay through August or so, and then we'll start hearing the individual, hearing from individual districts that they will, if they're encountering problems, and I think that's really is going to be the test when we hit August. And that's the period where districts, they'll have a number of options. They can come to us and, again, if we had money to hand out, we could adjust payment schedules for them. We won't in August. There's an allocation of funds that we put out in July. There are some deferred funds that will go out to districts mid-July, and that'll be the last infusion that we have in our accounts up here to send out to districts. Beyond that, they're going to be looking at their own reserves. They're going to be looking at borrowing from their local counties. They're going to be looking at private markets. And I think August and and as we, especially as districts start looking at making that August payroll, I think that's going to be a real critical time that I'm going to, I think I'm a little bit nervous about what happens.
President Nye.
Member Baum?
I would say suffice it to say, though, I don't know of any district that has funds to go through the next year. I know of districts that can go through a month or 2.
3 months.
But
I'm talking about reserve money.
right, no reserves. That would only, there's no district that I'm aware of has reserves that could keep it operating for a year without having to go into a line of credit or anything like that. The most, our district, which we think has a healthy reserve, can get us through September maybe.
I think that's accurate. In terms of making payroll and actually having cash on hand, we're talking of a matter of 2 to 3 months that most districts could weather something in that range. I think beyond that, it may be, this is how I heard the comment before, was that, which is kind of looking at the budget on a different level, that I think there are districts that are managing their reserves in such a way that, as long as if the state flatlined the budget again for another year, that they might be able to tap their reserves again to protect some key counseling or some key courses. So they could use their reserves as a complement to the state funds to kind of try to weather the storm.
That's if the same state, but funding comes through as
Yeah,
this year.
but if the state funding gets zeroed out, cash will run out very quickly in the districts.
Okay, we have a few people from the public who have some thoughts.
Okay, Nahasi Lee, and Mr. Lee, if I could ask, because I'm not sure, were you asking to speak on this item, the budget, or the student Senate budget item?
I was gonna, when I come before a board such as yours, I like to impress upon you the fact that your community college education actually works with us students. So in utilizing my creative thinking capacity, sometimes I handed you a budget. The topic is budget. The money that this gentleman just finished talking about are the resources of the state of California. So however you interpret that.
Well, I tell you what.
I handed that out for your perusal. I'm going to speak to some significant points on it, but it has to do with the money of the system, which is inside the budget.
So it does have to do with the state budget as well as this?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Very well. I want to remind speakers that we do have a 3-minute limit.
Thank you very much. Well, I get reoriented. Could you let me know when my 3 minutes start?
Right now.
Okay. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce a person in the audience by the name of Rachel Richards, who is the new Student Senate Treasurer. I'm before you today because I was with the students yesterday, and they had this item in their hand, which is a budget, which has to do with money within the community college system. As you'll note, there's $30,000 on here that was it's supposed to be directed to them by the chancellor's office. When I served as a statewide student senate representative, the chancellor's office provided $50,000. The legislature provided $50,000 to statewide student leadership, so that we had an opportunity to participate in the shared governance process. I generally keep a document with me that was prepared by the 1990 Board of Governors that talks about encouraging greater student participation in governance. On this budget item, you'll see 3 lines that say Board of Governors. It says governance. It's student leadership participation in governance. It said Board of Governors, there's a 0. It says attendance in Sacramento, says 0. There's other advisory groups that say 0. AB 1725 suggested that somebody's supposed to be responsible for getting students to shared governance participation throughout the state. I don't like math, but I did a critical calculation. I said if you multiply 2.9 million students by the $26 for 1 unit, it comes out to $75 million. I could talk about $1 of that. I could talk about 10 cents of that. I'll only talk about 1 penny of that. If 1 penny of that $26 that students in the state of California pay, there would be $750,000 available for the student leadership, the students and student leadership to participate in the shared governance opportunities that are supposed to be at their disposal. I'm not going to go long. I introduced Ms. Richards because I live in Los Angeles, California, so I'm not going to be able to get up here often. When I do get up here, I'll find as many creative ways that this agenda allows for me to come before you and speak before you. I'm going to say it like this. Most everybody in this room is paid because of the largesse of students participating in community college education. Every member of this board, I've been told, receives a stipend. What the students and their inability to receive funds is like everybody on this board receiving a stipend except for the student representative to this board. That probably isn't fair. That's why the student gets the same amount of money that everybody else does. I'm here because I believe that students shouldn't have to go begging in the state of California to get any sort of resources to be able to participate in a legislatively mandated circumstance called participatory governance or shared governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jonathan Lightman from FAC.
Thank you, Member Himmelstein and Chair Malumed and Chancellor Scott for the opportunity to address you today. Very quickly, I would like to commend the work of Vice Chancellor Skinner and the other Vice Chancellors, as well as our cooperative relationship with the League and with the Student Senate in terms of delivering a unified voice on the budget. It's so incredibly critical, and we've been doing a better job each and every year for the last couple of years. And legislators, in fact, have commented to us that compared to the other segments of public higher education, that our efforts at harmonizing the budget message has enabled them to do a better job on our behalf. We had a meeting with the Speaker of the Assembly, and Vice Chancellor Skinner, Chancellor Scott participated, and there was a common message that we delivered at that meeting, which we'd like to repeat to you, and that is that at some point in the process, there is going to be a deal reached on Proposition 98. The message that we communicated and the request that we made to the Speaker is that when that deal is cut, we'd like to ask the leadership of the legislature to consult with the community colleges on that community college portion, because that's something that has bitten us in the past. And so there's been a question among members of the Board of Governors in prior discussions on the budget, which is what can we as individual members of the Board of Governors do? And the one request that we would ask you to communicate both to your own legislators as well as to legislative leadership is that when that deal on Proposition 98 is cut, to please ask the legislative leadership to consult with the system and with Chancellor Scott, Vice Chancellor Skinner on the impact of community colleges. Thank you.
Were you going to say something? Thank you very much for your report. We'll be watching the news. We're going to move on to item 4.5, state and federal update. I assume state is first, but if you want to be together, that's fine.
Come together.
Good afternoon, President Malumed, members of the board, and Chancellor Scott. I'm going to give you a quick update on state legislative activity, and Valerie will do the same on federal activity. You have before you reports summarizing the major activities going on in both arenas, so you can read that at your leisure for more details about various bills and legislative initiatives. What I'd like to start with is, especially coming off a discussion about the budget and the crisis we're in, it's interesting how that has played out with respect to legislation. This past year, you never know coming into a year like this. We knew this was going to be a challenging year fiscally, and you never know how things are going to turn out from a legislative standpoint. And I think it's interesting to note that this year, the legislature has really taken a somewhat reform approach to policy and has stepped back and looked at various issues that have been ongoing issues. Some we've been dealing with for 20-some years, that being the transfer issue, and others that have cropped up in the last several years. And it's interesting the kind of momentum that has built around some of these key issues. So what I'll do is just touch on those key issues to give you a flavor for what's on the minds of legislators and what kinds of legislative measures that are really going to make a difference in how we do our work. So the first one, which you do know about, is SB 1440 by Senator Padilla. This is the transfer reform bill. The Board of Governors, you are co-sponsors along with the CSU, the Student Senate from the community colleges, and the student organization from the Cal State University, as well as the Campaign for College Opportunity. So this is a fairly large group of co-sponsors, and I think an indication of the kind of support and momentum that has built around this issue. The bill, when originally considered back in late January, early February, the idea was, geez, it's time to really do something on transfer. And I don't think many of us looking closely at the legislation at that time thought there was the chance that it would evolve into the kind of measure it has become. And as you know, it provides a guarantee to our students that if they get this AA degree in designated as transfer and meet the various requirements outlined in the bill, they are guaranteed admission to the CSU system. Now, I won't get into the details because there are a lot of details behind that general concept. One is, well, what about if they want to go to a specific campus or a specific program? Those are all critical issues that staff and the segments have been working on, and the academic senates have been working on to fine-tune those kinds of details. And those conversations go on today. For example, if a student is majoring in an AA and political science, they will be given special consideration to go to the CSU if they meet all the requirements for transfer. And those details are as they say, the devil's in the detail. So the bill right now is in the second house, and it's in the Assembly Appropriations Committee. And it's expected to be heard probably the first or second week in August. It is co-sponsored by about 37 authors, and both sides of the aisle. And I think, as I may have pointed out before, it's interesting the way you can plan legislative priorities and think that you're moving ahead, and then all of a sudden something happens and certain bills lose momentum, other bills gain momentum. This bill, that moment was during a master plan committee hearing where Chancellor Scott and CSU trustee Herb Carter gave a very compelling testimony about how critical it is that we put students first and that we deal with this transfer issue once and for all. So what this has become is a real historic piece of legislation that I don't think anyone imagined would have taken place in what is otherwise a very challenging year. We have gotten signals from the administration that the governor is supportive of this bill. We've had some conversations with Department of Finance. We have a couple of technical issues that we still need to work through, i.e. How to handle the mandate, because that is a big no-no in our system, that you try to stay away from mandates. But because this is so critically important, we believe that this bill requires 100% participation. So Department of Finance, legislators, and the governor's top staff understand how important that is. So that's probably the most critical issue pending right now, is how to figure out how to get around the mandate and still ensure 100% participation. So I'm hopeful that things will move along well and that we'll have a successful bill at the end of session and hopefully a nice signing ceremony. So this will be a key accomplishment for you and for the community colleges and the CSU. Now, just one little side note, as we talked about earlier, UC was not part of this initial legislation. We can't require them to do this anyway through statute, and the majority of our students do transfer to the CSU. So we thought that was an appropriate way to structure this legislation. Since then, the UC has said that it supports this bill in concept, and I think what that means is that they need more time to evaluate how you would implement this in their system. So if that's the case, and if in fact they decide to come on board at some point, as well as the private institutions, this would then be the course pattern that all students could potentially follow to transfer to a four-year institution in California. Another bill, I'll just point out, financial aid is a big issue at the state level and at the federal level. And we had a lot of bills introduced early in the year. Most of them are not, well, a couple of them have been narrowed significantly and are still moving, but there's one in particular, probably triggered in large part from a lot of press articles that talked about how community college students are leaving significant amounts of federal aid on the table. Well, when you, and the initial response is, well, then just require all BOG fee waiver students to fill out the FAFSA in order to be eligible for BOG fee waiver. Well, in the course of those negotiations, it sounds simple, and it sounds like a good idea to increase participation in federal aid programs, but it's actually fairly complicated, because what we learned is that 80% of our BOG fee waiver students actually do complete a FAFSA for federal financial aid. So it turns out that that may not have been the crux of the challenge. The crux of the challenge is, how do we get those students who aren't applying for any financial aid, state and federal, to in fact complete the FAFSA and become eligible for these various financial aid programs. So AB 1997 went from a requirement that all BOG fee waiver students complete a FAFSA to instead establishing a pilot program for up to 10 community colleges, voluntary, that want to examine how we can expand participation in federal programs and draw down, and in fact, draw down more of those federal financial aid dollars, which obviously is critical for a good number of our students. So we are supportive of this bill, and this is now in the second house. It's in the Senate. But I think that it's an important bill because it also, this issue came up in budget conference committee discussions, and because this bill is moving through the process and and we're in support of this effort, we were able to get behind this legislation and did not go down the route of establishing an additional financial aid requirement through the budget process. So folks are happy that we're getting behind this effort, and hopefully we'll learn a lot more through this pilot project about how to increase participation. The next issue that I'd like to touch on is Senate Bill 1143. And this is a bill that has actually been discussed in general forms for a number of years, but this year a very aggressive bill was introduced that would have compensated us based on the average of completion at the end of the course and the third week of the course, which would have had a tremendously negative impact on our base budget. The community college system, virtually every stakeholder got behind in opposing this bill, and eventually it was defeated. What happened then was the author has asked that the community colleges work with her and come up with an amended version of the bill, which has since happened. And this bill now directs the Board of Governors, as the Chancellor talked about earlier, to convene a task force over the next year to look at what are the various components and measures of seriously looking at how to improve student success and completion. So I think this has been a very how can I say, this bill has been a very challenging bill for many of us in the system, but I think ultimately we're in a place where the community colleges can really set the framework for how we address this issue. It's complicated. There are no quick fixes. We all know that. And we know that some of it is resource related. And I think that we were able to convey that to the legislature. They understand that doing things differently and really reaching out to help those students who aren't prepared for college and to succeed will take some investment. But I think the challenge for us is to help identify how to strategically make those investments and have some accountability for the kind of progress that we're making. So that'll be an opportunity for all of us in the course of the next year. And the Board of Governors and the Chancellors will be asked to come back to the legislature and report on the plan that you develop. So that bill is moving along, and it still has some opposition. There are some within the system that are still uncomfortable, but I think by and large has been embraced as the community colleges can put its best thinking and try to come up with the best strategy to deal with this obviously challenging problem. And so that'll be something we'll be talking about, assuming that this gets adopted, we'll be talking about for a long time. Lastly, I want to touch on the bond bill. Assistant Vice Chancellor Fred Harris talked about it earlier. It is something that is obviously very important to us. We didn't have a bond bill in 2006, and we do have a significant backlog somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.6 billion. This bond bill has an upward battle. There's a lot of concern about the debt service and what the state is able to absorb at this point. And there are some other bonds out there, high-profile bonds such as the water bond. So this will be discussed in the context of the overall bond picture and what amount of debt the state is able to absorb. So we'll obviously be following this very closely, advocating on behalf of our needs, but this is going to be a challenging issue for us, probably till the last night of session. And just so you know, the last month of session is from August 6th to August 31st. This is a short, the session adjourns early because it is an election year, and obviously that's going to keep many folks busy. The last month of session, we're going to be dealing with lots of activity within appropriations in both houses. Most of the key bills that I've talked about currently sit in one of the appropriations committees. We will have, 3 of you are pending before, will be considered by the Senate for confirmation. At least a couple of you, maybe 3 of you, will be set before the end of session. And so that means probably sometime in early August. So that's something that we're going to be monitoring and working with you all closely on as well. The last thing that I just want to point out, you got a copy of the agenda for tomorrow's joint board meeting between the State Board of Education and the Board of Governors. This is a 2-hour meeting, and so we'll jump into some significant issues. And the meeting will be held here, so that'll make it convenient for you, and everyone can sit around the table. We have enough room to accommodate everyone. And we think it'll be an opportunity to really talk with your K-12 colleagues on issues that obviously transcend K-12 and higher education. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Member Ramos?
I'm not sure I have a question. I think I have a comment, but maybe it will lend itself to a question at the end of the day. I'm really happy about this meeting, as I think we all are, coming up tomorrow with the State Board of Education leadership. And I'm intrigued by the program, which I think, in its own right, substantively makes a lot of sense to me. But I'm a little bit confused because perhaps I misunderstood, but I really thought that the nature of the engagement we would have with our colleagues on that board would be much more strategic in terms of how we coexist more copacetically, how we do our work in a way that is more complementary and how it leads to shared policy leadership rather than just sort of talking about some of the important but more episodic issues of the day. So I don't want to complain about this agenda. I think it's a healthy, appropriate, and timely agenda, but I'm just hopeful that this coming together will set the stage for a much more strategic and far-reaching conversation with our colleagues about how we do our business in a way that is complementary and ultimately in the best interests of the students, the faculty, and the communities that we serve. Is that a possibility that
I'm going to have
correct?
Vice President Himmelstein
Thank you.
respond to that.
Point well taken. I think this, first meeting is reflective of our meeting and where we all as a board discussed topics that we wanted to broach with the State Board of Education, as well as hearing from the field on those topics. I think that the key thing here is we're actually establishing the relationship. It doesn't really exist. This is fairly unprecedented for a while. So I think it's prudent of us to take the time to raise some topics, establish the relationship, get to know these folks. And I would agree with you. You're 100% right. We should move on down the road to some strategic planning that makes sense for the students that we both serve.
Thank you.
I'll do the Chancellor and then Member McDougall.
Also, I might point out, actually, as we began to develop this meeting, we were limited to 2 hours, not as a result of our choice, but as a result of their choice. We would have been happy to have begun the meeting, say, at 1:30 and lasted till 5:30. We didn't have that opportunity. Also, I'm going to compliment Marlene Garcia because it turned out that she had to do just about all the work, and I'm just stating that in this room. the staff of the State Board of Education indicated they were extremely busy and were not able to do much in the way of assisting us in this matter. I think maybe Board Member Himmelstein has said it well. This is an introductory meeting, and we would hope that it would lead to additional meetings. But we sort of had to work with the limitations that we received. And I want us to have a very productive meeting, but I did want to point out that as I'd envisioned a 4 or 5 hour meeting, and we weren't able to get that done. And so we picked a couple of subjects that we felt were the most prominent in the terms of CTE, career technical education, and basic skills. And after some consultation, we did the work that we had in order to accomplish it. And I've been extremely complimentary of Vice Chancellor Garcia and the hard work that she's put in, because we really had to sort of initiate and do the work ourselves.
Member McDougall and then Member Davis-Lyman.
Yeah, 2 comments. Number one, I think these 2 areas are the 2 most important areas that we could begin a dialogue with the State Board of Education. I don't think there is much that has more of an impact on the community college operations than students coming from our high schools and the challenge of their relative level of preparation in meeting college-level courses. And whatever we can do to start a dialogue and begin to progress on that point, I think would be very, very helpful. I think it's an extremely sensitive point because it's always one that points backward as a responsibility or, quote, failing, unquote. And somehow we can't approach it in that way, but what can we do collaboratively to have a different result than the result we're having today? Number one. Number two, I think the career technical vocational education is a wonderful area for positive involvement. There's nothing that is encompassed in that area but positiveness in terms of collaborating with K-12, providing the opportunity for their students to enroll in community college courses and to get, if you will, a leg up on starting their college career or even thinking about college. I think it provides a marvelous opportunity for us. So, as with anything, it may be less than perfect given the amount of time that we have. There may be ways that these items could be structured that would make them more productive, but I think it's an excellent starting point on 2 very critical issues. What will be telling is what we agree to as follow-up to what occurs in these 2 hours. But I'm encouraged.
Thank you. Well said. Member Davis-Lyman.
Thank you so much, Vice Chancellor Garcia, for doing the hard work behind this, and also for our Vice President for taking the lead on this. As in any new relationship, I think this first meeting sets the tone of, and I agree with Board Member Ramos, of where we want this to go. And I'm wondering if there's a way to tighten up the being talked to part with the information that we need so that there is time for us to talk with each other. If we don't establish that at this first meeting, I think it's not going to happen and in further meetings. And so that is a critical thing that can happen tomorrow. What the outcome is we want to form a positive working relationship. So instead of just being talked at a lot, there's got to be as much room left, I believe, for us to talk with each other.
Oh, please.
Member Davis, Lyman, I agree. We will have some time during the meeting for sure, as says there, but we also, that's why we had made time for a reception and as
and a dinner as well to talk to each other, and again, as I said before, establish the relationship. So I think there is, certainly is time set aside, both during our session, although admittedly, we are going to get talked to, but we ask to be talked to,
Yeah.
Quite frankly. But we do have, looks like 3 hours to talk with our colleagues afterwards.
Thank you.
Marlene, did you want to say something?
I was just going to make a clarification that built into each of these presentations is a fairly sizable Q&A where, it will give you the opportunity to comment.
Member Azumi and then Member Lockyer.
I just want to pick up on what Member McDougall and Member Davis Lyman said about, and also what Member Ramos said about interaction. I think that, we have kind of a little model that we've already had in terms of relationships with the State Board of Education on the Joint Advisory Committee on Career Technical Education that Member Thomas and I serve on. And during the past several years that we've been members of that committee, where we serve with members of the State Board of Education, I must say that originally when Vice Chancellor Mian asked us to be members of that committee, there was a lot of suspicion and a lot of difficulty at first in terms of the relationships with the members of the State Board of Education because of the issue that we were dealing with in terms of the Perkins funding. And so, but I think that one of the things that I've noticed over the number of years that we've been members of this committee, that because of that relationship building, we've become, I think, a much more cohesive group, and I think there's been a lot more common ground that we can work on, as opposed to being kind of strangers trying to, dig at, a common pot of money. So, and I think under the leadership of Tana Thomas, who was the chair of the committee for a year, I think that was certainly what was our goal, was to find that common ground with our with our counterparts in the State Board. So I think that, what Vice President Himmelstein mentioned about, this being a first step, and I think that it is a good first step because, we're talking about career technical education, which again has been a common area that we have been talking about, at least within a subgroup of this board with the State Board of Education, that, we can build upon what we've accomplished so far. And then, hopefully, as two entire boards, be able to, have that trust in each other to be able to then take that next step where we address larger issues and also maybe have that more collegial type of setting where we can then, really, I think, address some of these larger problems. So. But I think that this is a good first step, so I want to, congratulate the Vice President for, his leadership in making sure this happened.
Board Member Lockyer and then Perez.
I wanted to also thank the Chancellor and the Vice President, and most of all, the Vice Chancellor, for materializing what was an idea that was mentioned by a board member, and it evolved. We are in a major budget crisis that we just discussed earlier, and have got to be more efficient with what we have. And when I'm looking at this agenda item and what we discussed in a piece of legislation, I believe that tomorrow, when the Board of Governors is beginning to meet with the State Board of Education to discuss K through 12 and higher education partnership and strengthening basic skills and college readiness, that is what Carol Liu is legislating. And that task force that we will then need to begin after that legislation becomes law, I don't think will be necessary. And I just want to ask if she's been invited to the meeting tomorrow and or told about what we are already doing within these governing bodies, so that we're not having to waste government dollars again next year to redo it. Thanks.
That's an interesting question. Have we invited others?
And or, if the Chancellor and the Vice Chancellor believe that they both have separate goals and, required outcomes, anything of that sort, then please let me know. I'm just, again, trying to use your time most efficiently in the ongoing years as well as tax dollars. And I just see the purposes of both being the same.
We talked at length with Senator Liu about the various efforts underway within the system and how serious we're looking at the issue of student success. We didn't extend an invitation to legislators to join us for this meeting. They're on recess right now, and frankly, that wasn't something that came up, but we certainly talked about how aggressive we're being in addressing this issue.
And I want to applaud you for the effort on that legislation and the amendments that were made to it. And I would encourage either in your role or the chancellor to, or I will be more than willing to call that legislator and let them know that the leadership here, through your leadership, is beginning to analyze that now and to rethink the need for that legislation.
Member Perez.
Two things I just want to say. I think these are two great topics because I think they're both very important to the work that we're doing, not only today but for tomorrow. I would just like to suggest that we can incorporate into this a discussion around next steps.
Yes,
and I
I'm
think
sure
that would help lead us into the next meeting. And before we have closing comments from both parties, maybe we can talk about next steps, and that will help lay that foundation for us to have a more fruitful relationship going forward.
Okay. Yes, we're planning that.
I believe that Mr. Buckley.
Oh, I'm sorry. Executive.
I certainly don't want to put a damper on what will be, I think, a wonderful discussion tomorrow. But it's important the board realize that the public session from 3:30 to 5:30 is an open public meeting at which all public business can be discussed. The gathering afterwards is a social gathering. Therefore, we do not have to comply with the Bagley-Keene Act and so on, but in order to avoid the Bagley-Keene Act, it must truly be a social gathering. In fact, I had a conversation with the counsel for the State Board of Education. They were nervous about having a social gathering, whether that would meet the requirements of the Bagley-Keene Act, and I assured them that our board is very experienced at having social gatherings where business is not discussed, so that'll be a more informal opportunity for discussion, just to clarify. Thank you.
And that just reinforces the fact why I think we need to talk about next steps at the meeting, opposed to trying to have that dialogue at the reception afterwards. Yeah.
And there have been many challenges, and I'm planning on sharing with people away from our meeting about it's hard to bring two large groups of people together. So to think about maybe having smaller groups meeting in the future on different subjects. So absolutely, we'll talk about that. And you have something else?
I just want to say that, of course, any good meeting involves the work of an expert, and that was in Jerry Griffin, who did a terrific job in adjusting, because we, as you probably noted, we shifted venues a couple of times, and Jerry was right there helping us figure this all out. So she did a great job, along with Sandy Jacobson from my staff.
Yes, definitely. Okay, Valerie? I just wanted to get a sense, Vice Chancellor Perry, you're going to be our last item today. How long do you need for your item about?
Oh, I could probably do it in 20 minutes or so.
Okay, so that gives you a little sense. Thank you.
Good afternoon. President Malumed.
Hello.
Is this on?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Vice President
We're just
Stein.
sleepy.
Yeah, yes. Members of the board and Chancellor Scott. My comments are going to be very brief this afternoon and are going to focus on 4 specific areas: education, jobs in the K-12 sector, Pell Grants, the tax extenders bill, and the veterans earmark. You have my report in front of you. I invite you to call, write, email if there are additional questions, as you may well have. The Congress has been on vacation or designated work session. They return today and tomorrow. And You may recall that we have been focusing on the education jobs bill. That bill is part of the 2010 supplemental appropriations process in Congress. The Senate finished its work on that bill before the holiday, a few days before, and the House actually finished work just at the last day. So there was not an opportunity for that appropriations bill to go back to the Senate for reconsideration. The amendment process did happen in the Senate, and so the 2010 supplemental appropriations bill has been amended with the two things that we've been watching. One, the education jobs bill, which instead of the initial amount of $23 billion is now $10 billion, and the Pell Grant earmark, the Pell Grant shortfall funding, which we had hoped would be $5.7 billion and is now $4.95 billion. The positive thing about these two pieces are that they got in there. The process has been very, very challenging and will no doubt continue to be. The higher ed piece of this legislation is the Pell Grant funding, clearly. And while the $10 billion for K-12 does not come to higher ed at all, the amendment submitted by Chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, Obi, does include some maintenance of effort language. And it's not absolutely clear that that will help higher education, but higher education is mentioned specifically. Basically, that any money that comes to the states through this education jobs provision shall not supplant the level of education spending at certain very specified levels. And I won't get into that because there are three different ways in which, it may impact the state. So there's a little bit of help there. The main thing that's important, again, to us is this meeting of the Pell Grant shortfall. Now, whether or not the education jobs bill or the Pell Grant shortfall is retained in the supplemental really depends upon what happens when it gets back in the Senate. It has to go back for reconsideration. The issues are that because of concerns over the deficit, whatever that supplemental cost has to be offset, and the current negotiation is over how those offsets will be funded. There was some initial plan right now in the bill. The education pieces are supposed to be financed through a number of sources, including some race to the top funding. The White House has said that's a DOA measure, dead on arrival, don't want to see that. So right now, the monies that we want are in the bill, but paid for through sources that others say they don't want to see happen. So we'll have to continue monitoring that and seeing what happens. So I will continue to keep you apprised of that. The Senate probably will not take up this bill on reconsideration until sometime the middle of this month. It could be later because there's a lot of negotiation, disagreement, argument going on both sides of the aisle and within parties, kind of similar to some of the things happening at the state budget level. That said, the tax extenders bill, which folks had hoped would get passed before the July 4th holiday, did not get passed. It is to be debated when they return, as I said, today and then tomorrow. Who knows? It'll happen sometime maybe in the next week or so. And that bill contains some specific language relating to community colleges and the $2 billion community colleges got through the Health Care and Education Reconciliation Bill. That bill funded the program, The tax extenders bill has some language in it that says that that $2 billion would be solely for the purposes of public nonprofit educational entities for obvious reasons. And our higher education advocates in Washington are certainly hoping to be able to keep as much of that $2 billion as possible. So we will be watching for that amendment as well. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is our veterans earmark. The appropriations process, the subcommittee appropriations process has been very much delayed, as has been the entire process on a federal budget. So subcommittees have not really begun to make decisions except for some minor exceptions having to do with the emergency supplemental appropriations bill, which really covers war spending, natural disaster spending, and a variety of other domestic needs. So we have heard that the earmark in the fund that we are looking at for the Vets Connect proposal is going to be heard on July 16th. If that sticks, we may know something pretty soon. People aren't thinking that that hearing is actually going to take place on that day, so we'll keep watching that. So I'm looking at perhaps October, November, and maybe as late as December until we find out the level at which we are going to be funded. And did you notice I said the level at which we will be funded? I'm being very optimistic about that. Those are the major issues. Again, there are other pieces here and there. There are a lot of very exciting things going on in the veterans community, and I think that lots of folks are looking to community colleges throughout the country to play a major role in welcoming our veterans home and helping them in transition and reintegration. I believe that the California Community Colleges has a great opportunity to be a leader in that, and we'll be working towards that end. I think the last thing that I will say is that as we go into our fall months, it's the time when we have an opportunity to educate members of the California delegation as well as other members of Congress about our financial aid issues. As Marlene mentioned, financial aid is huge at the state level as well as at the federal level. And we're going to take the opportunity to let folks know exactly what our financial aid numbers are here in California. Press upon them that Pell Grants, for example, are very critical and important here, even though there are students who are, in quotes, leaving money on the table. So we want to also let them know about our efforts to get more students applying for all forms of financial aid. So that's one of the things that we'll be doing in the fall. There are a few other things that we're going to be keeping our eyes out for. You heard Chancellor mention the Summit for Community Colleges. Still hoping that that's going to happen, and they're still looking at October, but apparently no solid date yet. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you for your report. Are there any questions or comments? Keep up the good work. Thank you.